Hi, I'm David at NoSlogans.org. It's my task today to help everyone understand something that many Americans, Republicans and Democrats alike, understood 60 years ago, but we seem to have forgotten. We think this is the most important economic issue facing Americans. Now, it's widely understood that in uninflated dollars, 90% of American families have less income today than they had in 1970, even though they're working longer hours. Now, that's just a symptom. Fortunately for me, there's a story I can tell you that makes it easy to understand the disease and the likely cure. It's about the greatest jeweler who ever lived, a man who fashioned a fabulous chessboard out of ivory and onyx squares and encrusted with jewels the like of which have never been seen on earth before or since. Now, the great jeweler said that because it was the finest chessboard in the world, he wanted the most powerful person in the world to possess it. So he took it to the Caliph of Baghdad, and he said, "This is my gift. I want nothing in return. However, I put all of my wealth into this chessboard, and I can no longer feed my family. So could you please give us 1 grain of rice for the first square? And since we can't live on 1 grain of rice, could you give us 2 grains of rice for the second square? And could you please double the amount of rice for each successive square?" Well, the Caliph could count by doubling. 2, 4, 8, 16, 32. That's still just a tiny pinch of rice. What the Caliph didn't calculate was the cost of the 64th square. Now, this is a number of a kind that I don't deal with very often, but that's 9 quintillion, 223 quadrillion, 300, well, maybe it would be easier to understand as more than 1,000 times all the rice ever grown on the surface of the earth. When evil little things grow by doubling, they can hide out in the woods for a long time, and then one day they walk out and eat the whole village. And the bad news is that the heirs of the great jeweler are still with us. But suppose one of them took a liking to you, and suppose he set up a trust fund in your name worth $1 billion, and suppose the trust fund earned 7.8% interest. Now, you're a modest person. You might have trouble spending an income of $1.5 million a week. So let's suppose that you let most of it ride. In that case, the wealth of your trust fund would double every 9 years, and in about 210 years, it would own all the wealth in the United States. I might still be able to have a house or a car if I rented it from your trust fund. If we graphed your trust fund, it might look like this. For a long time, your trust fund's wealth could pass completely unnoticed, and then one day, it would walk out of the woods and eat the whole village. Now, that can't happen. And the reason it can't happen is that the law requires trust funds to spend their income so that they don't wind up owning everything. But let's take a look at the heirs of the great jeweler. Let's take a look at some really rich people. I don't mean the 1%. They're not a problem. It's just easy to get data about them. Let's look at the richest 1/100th of 1% of Americans. That's about 11,500 families. They have a combined wealth of about $3 trillion that we know about. The poorest of them have incomes of perhaps even a little less than $200,000 per day. The richest, a couple of $1 million per day. Now, when you have an income like that, you don't go down to the mall and spend it. You reinvest it. So their wealth is doubling, well, about every 9 years. So think of them as a $3 trillion trust fund, unregulated, and just at the point where it's ready to walk out of the woods and eat the whole village. Now, the total wealth of the United States is also increasing, but it only doubles about every 16 years. So if we add that to the graph, we can see that the super rich will own everything that matters in about 100 years. Well, that can't happen either. But the reason it can't happen makes things worse instead of better. The total wealth of the United States cannot continue to double every 16 years for even 50 years. If it did, well, we'd all live in 70-room houses, drive 9 cars, and a quarter of the surface of the United States would be paved. Reality requires that growth and wealth taper off over the next few decades. That doesn't mean that we can't live better. A color television set is worth more than an old black and white TV, even though it represents less wealth. It costs less in uninflated dollars. But there's nothing about the tapering off and the growth of wealth that will have any immediate effect on the ability of people with incomes of hundreds of thousands of dollars a day to acquire wealth. I mean, who do you know who can compete with them in the auction house? So as growth and wealth tapers off, the super rich will own everything that matters in a lot less than 100 years. 50 years would be a reasonable estimate. Now, what would it be like to live under that kind of financial aristocracy? Well, we can get a pretty good idea because it's already happening to us. We just don't notice it because we are focused on our debt instead of their wealth. But when I was a child, the University of California was free. Now, graduates may have $100,000 of debt. That debt is someone else's wealth. We're pleased with the recovery of the housing market. Recovery for whom? There are not more homeowners, there are fewer. But there are new corporations like the Silver Bay Realty Trust that have bought up houses on the cheap and turned them into rental properties. Their investors think they know the future. The median American now reaches retirement age worth $87,000. That's not even enough to own your own home. So what do? Well, maybe you get a reverse mortgage to make the payments on your house and live on roughly $1,200 a month in Social Security benefits. Well, that reverse mortgage just sent the last of your wealth to the super rich. It's not hard to imagine a future in which almost every American reaches adulthood in debt and stays in debt to the company's store for the rest of his life. The other option, an entrepreneur, that's not in the future because you can't get a loan to start a business if you're in debt. Well, I've seen people start businesses in places where there was extreme wealth inequality. We call their businesses push carts. The United States already shares with the UK and Italy the lowest income mobility in the developed world. We have already stopped being the land of opportunity for our own children. So what can we do about it? Well, it hasn't always been true that the rich get richer while the poor get poorer. From the end of World War II to the 1950s, wealth inequality was stable. So we've asked, what are the policy changes that have destabilized wealth? And we only find 3 of them. Free trade agreements may have shipped some of our best jobs out of the country, or the decline of unions may have cost employees some of their income. But the 800-pound congressman in the room is changing tax policy. In the 1950s, Republican Congresses with Republican presidents taxed the super rich 60% of their net income. Today, it's 15%. We think we need to go back to a modern version of those 1950s tax policies. Now, there are objections to doing that. Some people say that high taxes would take away the incentive for entrepreneurs to do the great things they've done for our country. But a modern version of those 1950s tax policies would only have high tax rates on that part of your income greater than $1 million a year. And I'll tell you the truth, $1 million a year is enough incentive for me. When you have that kind of income, it doesn't take any incentive to become obscenely rich. The heirs of Sam Walton are going to become trillionaires without trying. Other people say, well, you can't tax the job creators. Well, the super rich are not creating jobs. The Fortune 500 companies are sitting on almost $3 trillion of uninvested capital because there isn't enough demand for their products. It's demand for products that creates jobs. And if there isn't enough capital to produce the products, then it's the Federal Reserve's job to produce the capital through the banking system. The only role for the super rich is to collect the profits. I'm often asked about the fair tax. Well, the fair tax is not progressive, and it would actually accelerate the rate of transfer of wealth to the super rich. The only really fair tax is one that leaves a little wealth for all of us. And there are people, I really understand who just feel like there's something wrong with taking that much money from people who have earned it legally. But great wealth is not created in a vacuum. Their factories depend on roads and sewers and water supply and waste disposal that we pay for. We pay for the police and fire departments that protect their wealth. And we support their patents and copyrights and trademarks. And once in a while, we go to war. And some of us sacrifice our lives in defense of capitalism. We're entitled to a share of the wealth. And if laissez-faire capitalism means that all of the wealth goes to 11,500 families, then laissez-faire capitalism needs a leash. Finally, there are people who are just concerned about big government and want to know what we do with the money. Well, Dwight Eisenhower built the interstate highway system with it. We could pay $100 billion a year on the national debt. Or we could make the University of California free again. That would create some opportunity for some people. But a month ago, I said that this month I would tell you where the money should come from to support Social Security. And I think I just met my promise. Even if we couldn't think of anything useful to do with the money, then we should just burn it. Because the one thing we must not permit is for 11,500 families to do to America what we do not permit trust funds to do to America. If you think what I'm telling you is just an opinion or that we've cherry-picked the data, please go to our website where you will find a slightly longer version of this that tells you where the data comes from, walks you through some easy-to-follow calculations, and covers a couple of things I've left out, like why globalization of wealth doesn't make any difference. If you want to help America, maybe you should start by sharing this story with someone else. And by the way, the wealthiest 1/100th of 1% of Americans now have 8 times the income they had in 1970.